A dog that looks like it's from another world, a train of death, and a city hidden from the public for years. This is the stories of Chernobyl you have never heard of. And at the end of this video is never before seen footage, so stay tuned.
1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine suffered a catastrophic meltdown. An assault of radioactive atoms burst forth from the wreckage and dispersed across Europe, even reaching as far as North America. In the area surrounding the power plant, an ecological disaster began to unfold. Pine trees crumbled, insect populations plummeted, polluted soil withered crops. In the hours following the meltdown, residents of nearby neighborhoods were forced to up and leave with little notice while the liquidators, military personnel and other civilians, moved in to clean up the radioactive mess. Pets were not permitted to travel with the evacuees and had to be abandoned. A directive by the Ukraine Ministry of Internal Affairs tasked military personnel with hunting down and executing the pets, including the many dogs of the region inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but some of the pets evaded capture, making a home in the CEZ. The liquidators would often feed and house the now strays, and the populations persevered. Today, Chernobyl's doomed reactor is entombed within a massive concrete structure known as the sarcophagus, but the effects of its meltdown linger. The radioactive atoms, radionuclides, released in the 10 days after the catastrophe still permeate the soil, the water and, yes, the animals that have made the CEZ their home, including Chernobyl's dogs. This unfortunate fate for the canines has a somewhat grim silver lining. By studying the DNA of these dogs, researchers could better understand how chronic exposure to radiation leaves long-lasting effects on physiology and health. In a new study, published in the journal Science Advances on March 3, researchers set out to decode the genetics of the canine population around Chernobyl, characterizing the genes of 302 free-roaming dogs that now call the power plant and surrounding region home. It's the first time a large mammal in the CEZ has been studied in this way. They offer a chance to see how the harsh environment, which includes exposure to high and low levels of radiation, can affect the DNA of animals who have lived and bred for 15 generations in this region, said Elaine Ostrander, a geneticist at the National Human Genome Research Institute of the National Institutes of Health and author on the study. By studying tiny changes in the DNA known as SNPs, the team were able to measure genetic similarity in these populations. Comparing Chernobyl's dogs to purebred canines from elsewhere in Europe, the team revealed that one group of canines living close to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, occupying Pripyat and the nearby train station, is a genetically distinct and closed family. This group differed, genetically, from dogs living just 10 miles away, in Chernobyl City, which appeared to have migrated more and bred with local dogs. This sets the stage for future studies aimed at finding mutations in key genes that result from the radioactive environment. Importantly, the study doesn't show that radiation in the disaster zone has, itself, caused changes or mutations in the dog's DNA. Inbreeding in isolation can cause the kind of changes the team has seen in the DNA. To tell if there were de novo radiation-caused mutations, the researchers would have needed to conduct whole genome sequencing of the dogs and see if there were any unique variants in this population, said Claire Wade, an animal geneticist and computational biologist at the University of Sydney not associated with the study. A de novo mutation is one that wasn't passed down genetically. By looking at a whole genome, all of an organism's DNA, rather than just SNPs, researchers can tease out more information, discovering mutations in genes that may have physiological effects. That's exactly what the Chernobyl dog team plans to do. With more than 400 DNA samples now collected, the researchers can begin to interrogate how DNA variation in these Chernobyl populations might help the dogs live in a highly radioactive environment. Perhaps, for instance, there are certain genes that have been switched on or off that confer a survival advantage in dogs closer to the plant. Comparing the whole genome sequences will help uncover these relationships. At present, a full DNA sequence has been retrieved for over half of the 400 samples, noted Tim Musso, a biologist at the University of South Carolina who has long studied the organisms around Chernobyl following the disaster and an author on the paper. A myth has persisted that life has returned and flourished in Chernobyl post-disaster, but that's not necessarily the case. Though the dogs are the first large mammal to be studied in Chernobyl, previous research has explored the effects of radiation on many different organisms within the region, from insects to birds. For instance, a 1997 paper showed that barn swallows exposed to radiation around Chernobyl had higher de novo mutations and were more likely to be partially albino, and Musso's studies have shown the abundance of species has dropped in contaminated areas. Other studies hint at the kind of revelations that might come from studying organisms in the CEZ. In 2020, scientists discovered a species of fungi with high levels of melanin, a pigment that can absorb radiation and turn it into energy. Producing high levels of melanin could provide a kind of protective sunscreen or shield for astronauts, where the threat of radiation is ever present. Will the genomes of Chernobyl's dogs provide a similar level of insight? That's an open question the team is eager to answer. We really have what we need to address questions regarding the role of the environment on survival in this environment. If you like this video and is not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing as it.
The Chernobyl nuclear power station in present-day Ukraine consisted of 4 1,000-megawatt reactors, plus 2 additional reactors that were under construction. On the night of April 25 to 26, 1986, Soviet technicians initiated a turbine test on Unit 4 just prior to a routine shutdown for maintenance. In order to perform the test, they unwisely disabled the emergency core cooling system and other key safety equipment. A chain of operating mistakes then ensued, resulting in a buildup of steam that caused the reactor to overheat. At 1:23 a.m., 2 to 3 rapid-fire explosions blew its steel and concrete lid right off and sent a fireball shooting high into the sky. This initial release of radioactive material was then compounded by several fires that broke out, including one inside the reactor core that raged for 10 days. All told, the accident at Chernobyl released at least 100 times more radiation than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Though massive, the explosions at Chernobyl killed only 2 plant operators directly and reportedly prompted a third to die of a heart attack. By comparison, 28 workers and firefighters succumbed to acute radiation poisoning during the first few months of the cleanup, and dozens of others were badly sickened. Heavy radioactive fallout, which spread as far west as France and the United Kingdom, likewise took a toll. Thousands of children who drank irradiated milk contracted thyroid cancer, at least 15 of whom ended up dying. Chernobyl almost certainly caused other premature cancer deaths as well, though the number remains hotly disputed. In 2005, the United Nations-backed Chernobyl Forum predicted that the accident would claim up to 4,000 lives in total, whereas Greenpeace put the number at 93,000. In the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl meltdown, the Soviet authorities largely kept their own citizens in the dark and made no attempt to alert neighboring countries. On April 28, however, the cover-up began falling apart when Swedish air monitors detected large amounts of radiation in the atmosphere that seemed to have originated in the USSR. Pressed for an answer, the Soviets admitted that an accident had killed 2 people at Chernobyl, but they also lied that the situation was now under control. It took until May 6 for the authorities to close schools in Kiev, the Ukrainian capital located about 65 miles from the plant, and to warn residents to stay inside. The full story of what happened at Chernobyl would not come out until years later. About 36 hours after the accident, the Soviet authorities started evacuating some 115,000 people who lived nearby, though not before many had already begun to suffer from vomiting and headaches. Believing they would soon be allowed to return home, they left behind assorted pets and valuables. Much to their surprise, however, all land within an 18.6-mile radius of the plant was subsequently closed off, and checkpoints were established to control access. This so-called exclusion zone was expanded in later years, leading to the evacuation of an additional 220,000 people. Though a few hundred residents have returned illegally, the vast majority of the area remains devoid of humans. As forests reclaimed land previously given over to industry and agriculture, and without people around to shoot and poison them, moose, red deer, wolves, lynx, bears, eagles and other megafauna reportedly began taking refuge in the exclusion zone around Chernobyl. This area has paradoxically become a unique sanctuary for biodiversity, the Chernobyl Forum declared in 2005. Yet even as some species apparently thrive, the radiation has been shown to cause significant and potentially deadly abnormalities in others, such as birds with deformed beaks. When Unit 4 exploded, the other 3 reactors at the Chernobyl nuclear power station were likewise shut down. But they were all restarted within a year and a half or so, despite international condemnation over their alleged design flaws and widespread contamination at the site. Thousands of plant operators continued trudging to work every day, only to see a turbine hull fire prompt the closure of Unit 2 in 1991. Then, in 1995, the newly independent Ukraine agreed to shutter the remaining 2 reactors in return for financial assistance from the group of 7 leading industrial nations, which includes the United States. Unit 1 stopped operating in 1996, and Unit 3 was the last to close in 2000. Though people still can't live there, the Ukrainian authorities opened up the exclusion zone to tourism in 2011. Since then, guides regularly take in visitors to view wildlife, as well as to explore the hastily abandoned ghost towns that dot the landscape, such as Pripyat, which once had a population of more than 45,000. In order to minimize exposure to radiation, the guides carry dosimeters and instruct their customers not to eat or smoke outside. At great risk to their own health, emergency workers dropped sand, lead and boron into the reactor core and cleaned up flammable debris, among other desperate attempts to stop the release of radioactive material in the frantic few days after the accident. They also chopped down and buried acres of pine forest, bulldozed villages and even slaughtered abandoned pets for fear they would leave the area and cause further contamination. The workers then entombed the reactor in a gigantic concrete structure, known as the sarcophagus, which over time has begun to deteriorate and spring leaks. If all goes well, a new 32,000-ton arch will be pushed on top of the sarcophagus sometime next year. According to the Ukrainian government, however, the site will not be completely cleared until around 2065. Meanwhile, radioactive particles will remain in the environment for hundreds of generations to come. 70 officers and men, ill-informed, unprotected and exposed to deadly radiation, were housed at the site along with the missiles back in 1986, under orders to arduously protect and save the weapons and structures rather than themselves. The site included the nuclear plant and the Chernobyl over-the-horizon early warning radar station, a 500-meter-long, 150-meter-tall installation designed to detect strategic missiles launched from the United States. The now rusty structure still towers over the area and is a major tourist attraction, a frightening monument to the Cold War that even the complex's normally fearless marauders have not attempted to cut into pieces to sell as scrap metal outside the zone, a routine business in these parts. In the aftermath of the 1986 explosion, as the government evacuated more than 50,000 residents from the town of Pripyat, including the families of nuclear plant workers, plus more than 75,000 residents of nearby villages, the men of the Chernobyl Air Defense Unit stayed put until they received fresh orders. 3 days after the explosion, on April 29, I arrived at the base with 30 heavy trucks and we loaded on them 30 missiles from the storage hangars, recalls Chernobyl, who headed the evacuation effort. 27 of them were conventional, but the other 3 were tactical rockets with nuclear warheads. We were to take them to a facility outside Boryspil, near Kiev. After that, we were ordered to go back and salvage the remaining equipment that could be dismantled. The men traveled, without protective gear, for 14 hours at speeds lower than 20 miles per hour as radiation from the explosion leaked into the air. Chernobyl admits he knew the dangers but says he was a career officer and could not disobey orders. They reached Kiev, about a 100-mile drive from the Chernobyl plant, in the middle of the night and rode through the city and across the Patton Bridge for 20 additional miles to Boryspil without alerting anyone or taking safety precautions. When we arrived at the designated base near Boryspil, we unloaded the rockets and all we got as preventive medicine was 2 bottles of red wine for each officer. The drivers got nothing, he said. The rockets came first, men second as usual. The nuclear warheads were immediately dismantled and taken to another place by a special team. Chernobyl and his men quickly returned to Chernobyl to pick up 6 rocket launchers, parts of the command guidance station and other equipment that the remaining base personnel had disassembled. All in all, they made 3 trips back and forth to haul away most of the facility's equipment before they were evacuated, though many stayed at the contaminated base for 2 to 4 more weeks to keep watch, Chernobyl said. Due to the Chernobyl catastrophe, the Soviet Union's strategic defenses were dealt a major blow, as they were rendered blind in the west flank by the closure of the Chernobyl early warning station due to lack of power and air protection, said Chernobyl's former comrade in arms, retired Lieutenant Gen. Igor Romanenko, the former deputy chief of the Ukrainian General Staff. The strategic defense installation was one of the 2 key elements of the Soviet Union's anti-missile defenses, Romanenko said. The other one was in the Far East, so all of the central, southern and western USSR became exposed to missile attacks. This was a heavily guarded secret at the time, he said. The rocket system in place at Chernobyl was the S-75-4M, a modernized version of the system that shot down American pilot Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane in 1960, Romanenko said. Its tactical nuclear warhead modification is intended to destroy a cluster of planes and rockets or a heavy bomber, he said. Romanenko, who in 1988 assumed command of the Kiev Air Defense Brigade, also confirmed that the battalion that evacuated from Chernobyl had nuclear-tipped missiles in its arsenal. They were to be used only in case of clear danger of nuclear attack, he said in an interview. It worked like this. The decision was to be made in Moscow. Moscow would send me, as a brigade commander, a coded message to set the nuclear-headed missiles in a combat position. Then I was supposed to receive another coded message authorizing the launch. And only then would I issue an order to the commanders of my battalions to push the button. Required to be beside him in the control room prior to such a launch would be a special task officer sent by Moscow whose job it was to ensure that the commander obeyed orders. That man was always armed. If I ignored the order, refused to carry it out, the officer was instructed to kill me on the spot, Romanenko recalled with a smile. At Borispol, Chernobyl and his men spent days and nights on end scrubbing their radioactive equipment and trucks with special powder. My men washed the stuff with the hardest brushes ever until they were falling over with fatigue and with bleeding blisters on their hands, but nothing helped, said Chernobyl. We kept measuring the radiation and it was still the same, still high. Moscow then ordered the trucks back to Chernobyl to be left in a so-called cemetery for dirty vehicles, helicopters and other equipment. But they told us to keep the system parts, the rockets and the launchers at the base near Borispol, he said. After what he calls the operation in futility concluded, Chernobyl said he burned his uniform, boots, hat and underwear behind the barracks. The soldiers were discharged while the officers continued to serve in various units. They never really knew how much radiation they were exposed to, Chernobyl said. 3 years later, a commission of civilian and military experts came from Moscow to see if the rockets and the rest of the equipment could be reused. Prior to the group's arrival, everything was again washed and scrubbed for several days, Romanenko said. The experts measured all the stored hardware and rockets brought from Chernobyl and their counters went mad. Said Romanenko. They told us we were crazy to keep this stuff at the base, told us to get rid of it as soon as possible and then left in a hurry. For 3 years the contaminated hardware had been kept in the area of the unit. When Chernobyl got back from that trip, he repeated the ritual of burning his uniform. No one in the world knows that we existed and what we went through, he said. And all for nothing. All so stupid and futile. We didn't save anyone. We didn't clean up anything. All those I personally know and have kept track of all these years are either badly sick like myself or dead by now. My driver who accompanied me on all the convoys was discharged and died at 28. My fellow deputy brigade commander, who was also dealing with contaminated equipment, died in 1995 of cancer. Warrant Officer Petro Pozyra went blind. And so on and so forth. I have a heart ailment and every year spend a couple of weeks in hospital. The cardiologist who has been treating Chernobyl for the last few years once asked him to retrieve his Chernobyl-era medical records from the military. But Chernobyl was told that the records no longer exist. Here I am on a pension with a monthly Chernobyl health compensation of about $11 a month, he concluded bitterly. It is not even enough to buy a bottle of decent vodka, let alone medicines. The official death toll related to the explosion is listed as 39, but out of the officially registered 3.2 million people who were exposed to radiation in Ukraine alone, 1.3 million have died in the last 33 years, said Vladimir Kovchik, a former Chernobyl cleanup worker who is now a leader of a group that aims to protect the rights of fellow survivors. For the last 4 years, the government of Ukraine has been allocating $70 million annually for the needs of the affected. That is $37 per person per year. Not a penny more. How many of those remaining 1.9 million people affected by Chernobyl are sick and we can't even tell? The doctors will never tell you you are sick or dying because of radiation. Chernobyl guides never take visitors to the former anti-aircraft base. It is off limits across an overgrown field and dense pine forest. After a recent tour of the zone, a group of Danish tourists emerges from the gates of Chernobyl and their bus is thoroughly checked for radiation. Each tourist receives an individual radiation test as well. All of them are found clean, same as the bus. Tired but happy, they can go back to Kiev and fly home. Now I clearly see that humans are the most stupid thing ever brought to Earth, said Rasmus Schagelrup, a 32-year-old shipbuilder from Copenhagen, as his friends were buying expensive Chernobyl souvenirs and cold drinks at a kiosk next to the zone's gate. We keep inventing things that don't make the world better, and we are discovering things that will destroy us easily, and that is completely insane, isn't it? Most tourists are very grateful for the unique experience, their guide, Alexander Domashenko, said. They are really impressed by the heroism of the cleanup workers who prevented the disaster from poisoning the rest of Europe for centuries to come. They love to make selfies in front of the sarcophagus that covers the damaged reactor.
25 years ago, a mistake at the control switch caused the worst nuclear accident in history. Emissions from the reactor at Chernobyl, in what is now Ukraine, were 100 times greater than the radioactive fallout from the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Fallout spread across the Northern Hemisphere as far as North America and China. Most heavily hit were areas closest to the disaster: Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. A new book, Chernobyl: Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and the Environment, published by the New York Academy of Sciences, says that the impact on health is far worse than reported, and that Chernobyl is not over. Its toxic nightmare will go on for generations.
This book surveyed well over 5,000 articles that have never been translated before into English. Mostly they were published in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia.
And what that data shows is that almost 1 million people died as a result of the radiation from Chernobyl. That number dwarfs the 4,000 that the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency claim. Book authors say that the numbers are being lowballed because the International Atomic Energy Agency's mandate is to promote the nuclear industry.
Well, they have an agreement as of 1959 that is still in effect, that neither the World Health Organization nor the International Agency for Atomic Energy will publish anything without the approval of the other.
And that means that IAEA, with its strong nuclear industry bias, has veto power over the WHO. Authors say this agreement makes disclosure of the full impact of Chernobyl impossible. Professor Alexei Yablokov, the eminent Russian biologist and book co-author, calls for change.
Мы говорим, расторгните это соглашение. Пока это соглашение существует, верить данным, которые приводит Всемирная организация здравоохранения, нельзя.
And authors say that nuclear advocates not only minimize and trivialize fears about radioactivity, but do so by ignoring selected scientific data. They cite a 2005 report by the Chernobyl Forum as an example. The report, produced by a group of agencies led by the IAEA, said that outside of a spike in thyroid cancer cases in children, there is no demonstrated increase of cancers due to radiation in most affected populations.
Собственно, вот этот Чернобыльский форум публикации и вызвало к жизни нашу публикацию. Когда мы увидели эти данные, мы просто пришли в ярость, потому что, чернобыльские заявления этих Чернобыльского форума, как это может быть? Это идет против научных фактов, это идет против жизни. Работ на самом деле чернобыльских опубликовано очень много. По моим подсчетам, около 30 тысяч научных работ. Чернобыльский форум, о котором я говорил, основывается, например, на 300, на 400 работах, опубликованных только в англоязычных журналах. Он игнорирует вот те работы, которые были опубликованы в России, вроде бы под тем предлогом, что они не соответствуют научным протоколам. В общем, всякие уловки, чтобы не учитывать эти работы.
The Chernobyl Forum report also said the illness associated with radiation may actually only be psychological or stress-related, something called radiophobia, a fact which book authors vehemently contest.
Официальная точка зрения, что они признают, что на территориях, которые поражены чернобыльскими, состояние здоровья очень плохое. Но они говорят, это потому плохое здоровье, что люди боятся радиации, что у них радиофобия, что они там ведут неправильный образ жизни, что они очень бедные и так далее. А мы на это отвечаем. А какая может быть радиофобия у лягушек, у крыс, у птиц, у рыб, которых мы изучаем там, и которых то же самое поломаны хромосомы, также нарушен иммунитет. Все примерно те же самые изменения здоровья, плохие изменения здоровья наблюдаются, которые мы видим и у людей. Какая там может быть радиофобия?
The scientists whose work is published in that book studied wild and domestic animals, fish, birds, plants, trees, mushrooms, bacteria, viruses, everything. And all systems, all living systems were altered by the fallout from Chernobyl, no exceptions. The biggest concern probably in the book is that in Belarus, which is north of where Chernobyl was, that only 20% of the children are considered healthy. Only 20%. And that's by governmental data. Now, who's going to be the teachers and the artists and the writers and the politicians if 80% of your population is sick?
Belarus may be the worst affected, but a diverse spectrum of health problems are seen throughout areas that received high levels of fallout from Chernobyl.
Увеличивается весь спектр заболеваемости увеличивается. И раковые больные, и сердечно-сосудистые. Огромное количество людей гибнет от сердечно-сосудистых заболеваний, темп которых гораздо более серьезный и высокий, чем на других, менее загрязненных территориях.
Birth defects, birth losses, neonatal deaths, childhood leukemia, massive thyroid cancer, lung disease, immunological problems.
Увеличиваются желудочные заболевания, увеличивается иммунитет, больше нарушается иммунитет. Такие странные последствия, как раннее постарение, очень характерны для этих территорий. То есть паспортный возраст, мы говорим, отличается от физиологического возраста. Физиологически на 5-6 лет люди на территориях, которые загрязнены, раньше стареют.
Particularly troubling is the link between radioactivity exposure and diminished intelligence.
A study just came out in Sweden that showed that children who lived at a higher elevation in Sweden that they know received a higher dose of the fallout from Chernobyl have decreased academic abilities compared to their compatriots in the rest of the country. Now, this is very serious.
Даже малые дозы радиации, особенно когда они постоянно повторяются, когда они из года в год, из дня в день, маленькие, но постоянно повторяющиеся, влияют на мозг. Есть доказательства, научные доказательства, прямо с томографией и так далее, показывающие, что мозг чуть-чуть меняется. Чуть-чуть органические изменения мозга. Как это не страшно, как это не печально звучит, но действительно вот эти жертвы Чернобыля, они и в том числе и вот их поведение, их возможность обучения, они будут отличаться.
This is probably the greatest threat to humanity is the loss of intelligence as a result of brain damage from radioactive fallout from Chernobyl.
Despite assurances by international agencies that many contaminated areas are now safe, the effects of Chernobyl continue to be felt today by countries as far away as Germany and the United Kingdom.
В 2010 году в Германии около 15% добытых охотниками кабанов, особенно в Южной Германии, настолько высоко радиоактивны, что их нельзя использовать в пищу. И государство платит охотникам, если они убивают от кабана, которого нельзя есть. В Германии существует 90 участков, где можно проверить, 90 специальных станций, где охотники проверяют свою добычу на радиоактивность. Это сегодня, это в наши дни.
In Scotland, restrictions on the movement, sale, and supply of sheep due to unsafe levels of radioactivity were lifted only in June 2010. Restrictions on sheep in England and Wales continue. So how long will the effects of Chernobyl last?
Генетики говорят, что после того, как произошло сильное облучение популяции, последствия, как эхо генетическое, может быть в нескольких, до 7 поколений может такое последствие быть. Мы видим, что действительно у облученных людей изменены хромосомы, резко нарушены хромосомы, просто аберрации, хромосомные аберрации происходят.
And some scientists say that breaks in chromosomes resulting from radiation lead to devastating birth defects and mental handicaps.
У детей, которые родились и которые не были облучены, родились от облученных родителей, у них тоже изломанные хромосомы, значит, и они будут передавать эти хромосомы своим детям и так далее, и так далее.
The push to have nuclear power and the push to have power that maybe we don't actually need has consigned a random number of people to disease and death.
Человеку надо просто нужна политическая воля, чтобы отойти от атомной энергетики. К сожалению, атомная энергетика связана с атомным оружием. В этом причина того, что ни Америка, ни Россия, ни Англия, ни Франция не хотят отказаться от атомной энергетики, потому что слишком тесные связи с атомным оружием.
We can get along without nuclear power. We did, after all, for many, many, many years.
Yanov station near Pripyat became popular after the famous computer game Stalker, Call of Pripyat. But what is this place? Let's find out. Welcome. Yanov, Ukrainian Yanov, is a railway station. It was put into operation in 1925. The village and the station Yanov gave rise to the city of Pripyat. Prior to the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the station belonged to the Southwestern Railway. The station carried out passenger and freight work. Adjacent access roads of the Chernobyl NPP, OPC depots, oil depot and other enterprises of the city of Pripyat. The station is located on the Chernikov-Ovruch section of the Southwestern Railway near the city of Pripyat in Ukraine. Yanov has one main and three auxiliary paths. On one of the platforms there is a rare steam locomotive column. They were used to fill the steam boilers with water. In 1986, the village and the railway station of Yanov fell under a stream of intense radioactive contamination. Exposure dose levels in April 1986 were hundreds of millirentgen per hour. We add that the village and station are almost bordered by the Red Forest, so Yanov was evicted on the same day as Pripyat. On April 27, 1986, 254 people were evacuated from the settlement. After the accident, the railway section from Slavutik to Yanov station was electrified. Now electric trains run there daily, carrying Chernobyl personnel from the town of Slavutik to Semihady station and back. The background of radiation at the station Yanov today exceeds the norm several times. Although immediately after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant the background at this site was very high. In connection with this, the settlement of Yanov was demolished and buried, where about 100 people lived. At the station in the carriages there live the so-called metal, who are engaged in metal. The station is included in the transport complex of the state enterprise, Chernobyl Service. Station has one main, 3 receiving and sending tracks and several ways for accumulating rolling stock. There are devices for performing cargo operations, connecting the access roads of the Chernobyl NPP and ISF. The waterway of the steam locomotive column, has been preserved in the interchange of the western neck of the station. During the reconstruction of the railway section of Chernihiv, to ensure the maintenance of the personnel of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and contractors in 1986-1987, the station and the section from Yanov to Slavutik were electrified. At the moment, the contact network is not used and partially dismantled at the station itself and on the Yanov, Semihady distillation. Currently, one of the ways passing through the station has been reconstructed and used to provide construction work for the construction of the Shelter 2 facility, a new sarcophagus for the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Thanks for watching.
Cities and villages of this land were forever left in 1986 when their residents were forcibly resettled to other cities of Ukraine. In abandoned houses to this day you can find things of Soviet era, toys, posters, postcards, magazines and notebooks. In some places you can find parts of military equipment. This is a real museum of Soviet era. Welcome. The zone of alienation is contaminated with radionuclides and dangerous elements. Half-life of some of them has already occurred, and some will be dangerous for more than 1,000 years. In the beginning, 30 kilometers zone was created. Then 10 kilometers. The dirtiest place, but this does not mean that outside exclusion zone 1 cannot find a place with an increased radiation background. Later, a zone of mandatory unconditional resettlement, so-called second zone, was created. In her to this day, you can intend to have several hundred micro-Röntgen with a usual household dosimeter. After explosion at nuclear power plant, 2 radiation tracks were formed, north and west. These are dirtiest places in contaminated area. Pripyat was just between them, but still quite polluted and was decontaminated. On territory of zone now people work. Foresters, dosimetrists, firefighters, policemen, scientists, etc. All of them work on a shift basis. The administrative center of exclusion zone is city Chernobyl. This city is the administration of contaminated area AZO is located, which is Department of Ministry for Emergency Situations. Number of personnel working in Chernobyl zone and at CHNPP is about 5,000 people, about 3,000 live in Slavudik, rest live in Chernobyl town. Also there are self-settlers, people who did not want to leave their homes or those who could not live in new homes. There are no more than 300 people living in 11 abandoned settlements. Entire territory is guarded by police to protect zone of CHNPP, it's on foot, cars, horse patrols. Now exclusion zone totals about 13 checkpoints. Due to radiation background, export any type of products from contaminated area is prohibited. Local population is shift workers who come to temporary work in zone. They live in a hostel. These are foresters, police, workers of CHNPP, dosimetrists, hotel and shop workers, scientists, environmentalists. People who live there permanently return to Chernobyl. They are called self-settlers. They return despite government's ban. These people have a life now simple. A garden, fishing, picking berries and mushrooms, less often, hunting. Average age of population is more than 60 years, so hunting is not too popular here. Enterprises of contaminated area provide support to these people. They provide medical care, support the infrastructure, repair the buildings. All self-settlers living in contaminated areas. Marauders here existed from the first day of the existence of this territory. First years after the accident at CHNPP, marauders stole household appliances, furniture, carpets and all other valuables from Pripyat. On April 26, 1986, after CHNPP reactor number 4 explosion, many radioactive particles flew into the air. Emissions of radioactive substances were several times higher than after explosion of atomic bomb in Hiroshima. Now radiation level in CHNPP is 0.67 microsieverts per hour, which is 0.37 microsieverts higher than normal. For example, in Kiev and Moscow, level of gamma radiation averages 0.11 microsievert per hour. In some places in the contaminated area, level of radiation is very high and dangerous for life. You can go to Chernobyl tour only with experienced guides. The zone of alienation is divided into 3 sections, level of radiation in each of which varies significantly. Special area industrial site of CHNPP 10 km and 30 km zone. Highest level of radiation remains only inside sarcophagus. Some radioactive particles have now almost completely disintegrated. Strontium-90 and cesium-137 have half decay, half-life of which is 29 and 30 years, respectively. But America's 241 and plutonium-239 will remain for a long time in the Chernobyl. 40% of territory of zone will retain a potential danger for another 24,000 years. You can walk here, you cannot live. As soon as level of radiation in exclusion zone has decreased, it has become a popular tourist attraction, attracting people from all over world. Today there are only 2 legitimate ways to get to Chernobyl and Pripyat, with an excursion or an official delegation. All excursion routes are as safe as possible, and for 10 hours of stay in zone, tourists receive radiation equivalent to air travel. Thanks for watching. Orbita is a ghost town in Ukraine and it can be freely accessed because it is not guarded. It is very small, has only a couple of streets. The city of the ghost is in the center of Ukraine. Welcome. Not long ago, I came across an abandoned city with the orbit called Orbita. Urban Spectre is located 70 kilometers from Kremenchug in Chiron district. It was necessary to ride along an almost missing road leading far into the forest. Concrete remnants of the path resembled those that were laid in power cities. And it is not surprising, Orbita was an unrealizable dream of nuclear scientists. In 1976, the construction of a nuclear power station, which was popular at the time in the USSR, began to be built in the Chigirinsky district. Around the building a town with shops and kindergartens was born. In a few years, people built several large 9-story buildings resembling dormitories with typical one-room apartments. After some time, the construction of the nuclear power plant was frozen due to the Chernobyl disaster. The project was decided to replace the hydroelectric power plant, but this intention remained unfeasible. In 2000, the town of Orbita left the last inhabitants because of the unpleasant location. Jobs, schools, water supply and transportation were simply absent. After all, because of the freezing of the nuclear power plant, the city turned out to be unnecessary to anyone. Arriving to the ghost town, I was met by a strong wind, which was eaten off by the creak of the old frames and the noise of the surrounding forest. Impressions are as if the drop of a modern world has fallen on impenetrable forest. Walking through the long corridors, I went to an empty street and headed for a great store. The 2-story building has already been broken and stolen. The asphalt is covered with a thick layer of broken glass. The remnants of past life were scattered on the floor of the department store. Glass bottles of Soviet beverages, footwear, children's toys. A lot of dreams started here and a lot of dreams did not see the light of day at all. The earth is a wonderful place and we are just a small fragment of it all. Thanks for watching.
City 40 is a place that Russia never wanted anyone to know about. The people who lived there were sworn to absolute secrecy and sometimes they hardly knew why themselves. Those who lived in City 40 had their movements highly restricted, contact with the outside world was regulated, and in return the residents felt they had a home of relative peace in a turbulent Russia. This city is located deep within the forests of the Ural Mountains. It was named Ozersk, but its code name was City 40. It was never located on any map and was surrounded by heavily guarded gates and towering barbed wire fences. Those that chose to live in the city had their existence erased and they were never recorded on any Soviet census. To their families and friends, they had not simply moved to another city, they were missing altogether. Construction for City 40 began in 1946, and the plans and building of the city was done in complete secrecy. The city would be built around the massive Mayak nuclear plant that rested on the shores of Lake Irtysh. Workers and scientists came from all over Russia in order to lead and be a part of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. They were all brought there to build the atomic bomb and to never speak of any of it to anyone, ever. The city took its inspiration from Richland, Washington. Richland was the city that had given birth to the United States' own atomic bomb, Fat Man. Being modeled after an American city and determined to be even better, the city was something of a paradise in the middle of a struggling Soviet Union. Those who were relocated to the city and forced to give up many freedoms were not nearly as upset when they realized what they would get in return. Those who lived in City 40 had more than most Russians could ever dream of. Security from the dangers of the outside world, a city without crime, an excellent education system for their children, very well-paying jobs, and housing that was far beyond what could be found for regular people in the rest of the country. Those within the city had their freedoms taken away, but the Russian government still wanted to keep them happy in order to reduce the chance that any of them would try to escape and tell the outside world what they knew. It was believed that if they gave the people of City 40 a literal paradise, then the people of City 40 would be grateful and even willing to give up those freedoms, and for the most part the Soviet Union was right. Read on to see what life is like for people who still live in this secretive city. Even though the Cold War is over and the world knows that City 40 exists, that does not mean that life for people within the city has changed all that much. For the first 8 years after the city was built, the people were not allowed to leave. They were transferred to the city without a word to anyone, and then they were not allowed to go outside the border fences or have any contact with the world outside the city, not even with their families. After 8 years, things got a little better and people within City 40 could be granted visas to leave the city, but the visas are very strict as to what people can do. The visas are granted for specific days and even for specific hours. There are restrictions on where you can go and what you are allowed to do. In the early years this was perfectly fine because who would want to leave paradise anyway? For many people in the city that is still the case. The ones that live there are now are the children or the grandchildren of those that came in 1947. They have lived in the city their whole lives and they are told what a perfect place to live it is and they are happy. There are schools that offer them a better education than they could hope to have elsewhere, and an engineering school that provides the plant with a never-ending stream of engineers. But for all that the people are given, they are also dying, and most of them do not even know why. Living around a massive nuclear plant has its problems. In 1957 there was a major disaster at the plant that released more radioactive material than Chernobyl. Lake Karachay next to the plant is now so radioactive that spending just 2 hours along its shore would mean death. The plants and crops in the city are contaminated with radioactivity. Those that live within the city are very likely to get cancer, and most of them will die from cancer. 80% of the city does not even know the connection between the cancer and what is being done at the plant. 500,000 people in and around Ozersk have been exposed to massive doses of radiation. A clock 20 minutes from City 40 switches between informing people of the time and the level of radiation in the air. Buying vegetables and fruit from a produce stand now involves a Geiger counter in order to see whether or not the food is relatively safe to eat. Today, the Russian nuclear weapons stockpile and production of new weapons is still at City 40. Those within the city are still sworn to secrecy about what happens in the city and the perils they face. There are some who have spoken out, who have tried to get help for those suffering from cancer caused by the radioactivity. They get punished. To this day, no foreigners or non-resident Russians are allowed in the city without permission from the Russian secret police. Despite the warnings and the threat of imprisonment by Russian police, one foreigner, Samira Ghoshal, did manage to get into the city and talk to the people that lived there, creating the documentary City 40. Those that spoke to her did so knowing that they could face death if the Russians found out, just as Samira could face death if she was found there. The people that spoke of their lives in City 40 did so because they knew that they were going to die anyway, and at least they would die with someone knowing their story, and maybe with others in City 40 knowing what was really happening to them. For most of Russia and the world, there are no records of these people, and when they die there will be no record of their lives inside the secret City 40.
Close your eyes. Imagine a forest, acres upon acres of pine and birch and rolling hills. Herds of endangered horses have bred and increased their numbers. Packs of wolves roam the landscape. Rare birds roost all over. No humans, except for a sporadic few. Is this paradise? Maybe it is. You can go there. Take a vacation. Just a few ground rules. Don't pick the mushrooms. Definitely don't eat them. Don't eat outside, and don't smoke outside. Now, does that sound like a place you might want to go? Does it sound like a retreat worth taking? Open your eyes. You're standing in Pripyat, the last place on earth you probably want to be. It's been almost 30 years since Pripyat was a bustling metropolis of 50,000 residents. But it will be a long time before it is again. 20,000 years before humanity can return for any serious length of time. For those who don't know, or those who don't remember, in 1986, Pripyat was the site of the worst nuclear disaster in history. Chernobyl reactor number 4 melted and exploded. Metric tons of radioactive material poured into the environment and plumed into the air. People were evacuated, but the damage was done. Children born with cancer and birth defects for years after. Aid workers died within days of arriving at the site. Thousands more died from exposure to radioactive materials later. The death of trees and other wildlife. The impact Chernobyl was felt for miles. It will continue to impact our planet for centuries to come. Inside, a molten corium flowed like lava. When it finally cooled, it formed something dubbed the elephant's foot. It weighs at least several tons due to its composition, and is near the top of the list in terms of dangers created by man. The foot was so deadly that at the time of its formation, 30 seconds of exposure was enough to kill. 10 years later, 300 seconds was enough to kill. Today, an hour in its presence would be fatal. So there's that. When they took photos, they had to use a mirror and shoot around a corner. The first camera they attempted to use was destroyed by the radiation. At the time, most Soviet citizens knew nothing. Gorbachev didn't even hear about the explosion that occurred, so why would the average communist citizen know anymore? All they knew was something bad happened. A month later, the infamous sarcophagus was constructed and took 200 days to complete. It encased reactor 4 in 300,000 cubic meters of concrete and used over 7,000 tons of metal framework to keep it in place. However, due to need in the area, the plant continued to run until 2000. The remaining 3 reactors were shut off in 1991, 1996, and 2000 when an official ceremony was held. So what does the world look like since humanity gazed upon the face of fear? For one, the locals are bored. Many live just outside the exclusion zone, but don't seem to care. A number are employed by the booming tourist industry that's springing up in Ukraine. Over 10,000 a year make the trek to the area. Those tourists are mostly from neighboring countries, as Americans seem to be too frightened by the possible presence of mutants to make the trip. For some, it has become a novelty, akin to the world's largest ball of twine. A few might even fish the radioactive rivers and ponds. There's an extreme risk the deeper you go into the exclusion zone, but that doesn't stop some from treating it as a suggestion. The television station Animal Planet has even gotten in on the craze, sending the show river monsters to Chernobyl to hunt for a killer mutant predatory fish. They found fish, and those fish had mutated, but mostly it's adaptations to deal with the levels of radiation they're exposed to. Just like the vast majority of the wildlife. 30 years in, and the exclusion zone appears to be more of a nature preserve than anything, even if mankind has scarred that natural environment, at least for the next 200 centuries. Animals are thriving without humans in the area. The animal life may be different than we understand, but they've adapted the environment. They breed, they hunt, they continue on almost as if mankind had no impact. Almost. There's still major problems, and still massive setbacks to the ecology of the area. Nothing is as it should be. Inside the plant, black fungi have been found growing. They consume radiation using immense quantities of melanin in their skin. This might be a good thing, as melanized fungi could be used to clean up radioactive disasters, like Chernobyl or Fukushima. The downside is that the same fungi that would make cleanup easier, would also be a detriment. Black mold kills people, and if it's encouraged to grow, it could infect humans on a staggering level. In addition, scientists are noticing a disturbing phenomenon in the exclusion zone. While flora and fauna have rebounded in the face of the radiation, something else hasn't. Necessary microorganisms and invertebrates are missing from the food chain. While that doesn't sound like the biggest problem, it has the potential to become catastrophic. Without the microorganisms, fungi, and invertebrates, the cycle of life has been broken. Leaves that fall and plants that die aren't broken down and used by the surrounding environment. What this does is leave tons of material on the ground where it sits and waits. Normally, this wouldn't be a horrible problem to have, but in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, it could spark yet another disaster. Quite literally, every year, wildfires creep towards the dry litter. A major fire threatened the zone in 2012, 2014, and another fire consumed an abandoned village in April 2015. The flames never fully encroached, but the possibility does raise serious concerns. The biggest cause for concern is a reintroduction of the radioactive elements that spilled out of the reactor almost 30 years ago. The large water retention ponds exist in an extremely precarious situation, threatening to rupture and dump radioactive water into the nearby river. While it wouldn't cause major issues, the notion of thousands of gallons of radioactive water washing downstream is more than a little upsetting. On top of that, the brush fires in the exclusion zone threaten to do the same thing, reintroduce elements back into the air. By burning radioactive plant matter, the particles are carried up in the smoke and dispersed across Europe. However, so far no fire has done so. Radiation is leaching down into the ground, away from the surface. Plants are regrowing, and show little signs of being contaminated. Still, the site of the worst nuclear accident in history is a point of worry, and will remain as such. Though, not all news is bad news. 2015 marks the year that the new safe confinement structure was set to be finished. The NSC was partially funded by the Chernobyl Shelter Fund, and designed by French firm Novarka. The NSC was originally intended to be completed in 2005, but suffered a number of delays. The completion date was pushed to 2007, 2008, 2012, until eventually settling on 2015. However, after additional setbacks and a new round of investor funding, the new date is sometime 2017. So the question becomes, will it finish this year or will construction continue into 2017? By the time it has been completed, the NSC will have cost investors nearly $2 billion USD. In the meantime, scientists get a chance to study man's effects on his surroundings. How will plants and animals react to an apocalyptic event? How long will it take for life to overcome the adverse effects? It gives us great insight into nature's ability to adapt to change, as well as its ability to heal itself. At some point in the distant future, someone will be wandering through what used to be the Ukraine and stumble upon an ancient post-warning of radiation. By then, the disaster that was Chernobyl will be long gone, as will the effects. What will that world look like? How will nature have changed itself to deal? Given enough time, it might even revert back to the way it was before the devastation.